This could send shockwaves around world football that would eclipse anything that the FA could do to Manchester City. And hardly anyone's talking about it. It's October, and you would be forgiven for feeling like everything was business as usual in our beloved world of football. After all, Manchester United fans had to endure a depressing downpour, watching their shower of millionaires aimlessly, cluelessly wandering around the pitch at a walking pace, succumbing to their third defeat in the first six, but still no nearer to finding a replacement manager, and most of them resigned to the fact that there is no cavalry coming to save the day. Ten Hag can't be replaced because they don't have anyone who would replace him, and they've decided to stick with him at least for another couple of matches. Tottenham fans, by contrast, giddy in October, the excitement of ending the long drought for silverware, and the Champions League second game week about to get underway with some really great ties, a new format promising new excitement. It's only been a month since the transfer window slammed shut and all of the teams around Europe know exactly who's going to be in their squad and who's going to be playing, with no prospect of additions until the January transfer window opens again. But underneath this everydayness, this normalcy, there are the rumblings of an event which could have a seismic impact on that transfer window. It could, in fact, tear it apart completely, render it absolutely obsolete. And yet most people are totally oblivious to the chaos that could be around the corner. If you ask most people what the big court case is in football at the moment, they will of course tell you it's 115 or 130 charges that Manchester City face from the Premier League for rule breaks referring to financial possible malpractice, certainly lack of cooperation. But that is not the biggest court case in football. If you think that the Manchester City case has gone on for a long while, well, let me tell you, there is a case which is coming to its conclusion after 10 years. And it in fact involves an ex-Arsenal player. So what is this case I'm talking about? Well, The Guardian broke... The first place I saw the story was in The Guardian, and they're referring to it as a possible Mark Bosman 2.0. Now, I appreciate that not all the viewers of this channel are my age, and so for many of you, though you will have heard the expression Bosman ruling, you may not even be aware it refers to an actual footballer. Now, the Bosman ruling itself had the most dramatic impact on football, and the transfer window, as we know it now, exists as it does now because of that Bosman ruling. And, well, let me take you back to how that ruling came about. And it refers to Mark Bosman, who, it's not really fair to call him a journeyman footballer. He didn't ever represent Belgium as an international, but he did play 20 times for the under-21 team. He played for Standard Liège from 83 to 88, and for RFC Liège from 88 to 90. And at the end of his contract, he had agreed terms with Dunkirk. But as things were back then, even though his contract had expired, RFC Liège decided that they valued him at £500,000 or the equivalent, and that if Dunkirk wanted to sign him, they would have to pay that. Dunkirk were put off. He didn't move, and instead, RFC Liège slashed his contract by 75% and paid him only £500 a week. Mark Bosman didn't feel that this was fair, and with advice from lawyers, he decided to sue the Belgian FA and UEFA for impinging on his rights as protected by the 1957 Treaty of Rome, which allows for the freedom of movement within the European community. And on the 15th of December 1995, he won. UEFA had to scrap the practice of clubs being allowed to sell players even after their contract expiry, and it ushered in a new dawn of free transfers, which arguably has come to its height with the Kylian Mbappe departure from Paris Saint-Germain to Real Madrid. If you think of the amount of money he would have been able to claim personally because Real Madrid didn't have to pay a transfer fee, like the 150 million transfer fee Paris Saint-Germain had to pay for him, then you start to get an idea over the 30 years of how this has had an impact. It's ushered in a new age of agents and player power. So the players have finally gotten some of that money that would otherwise have been transferred between clubs. But this ruling, and then a side effect of this ruling was that it also upheld the fact that leagues in Europe should not be able to restrict the number of European nationals who played in them. At that time, leagues like Serie A had a prohibition on the number of foreign players that could play there. Famously, only 3 foreign nationals were allowed to play, and this was seen as illegal. So now European Union players can play anywhere in the European Union, no more than anyone else would be able to do in their working life. So the Bosman ruling in 95, to this day, over the last 29 years, has remained the single biggest court case, has remained the single biggest change in the transfer business. But on Friday, the 4th of October, the case that they're calling Bosman 2.0 might have an even more dramatic effect. And it involves an ex-Arsenal player, but not exactly one who's a household name. That player is Lassana Diarra. Now, he started his youth career and playing for Le Havre when he was snapped up by Chelsea. He won the FA Cup with Chelsea before signing for Arsene Wenger, who saw him as a good utility player in 2007. He only lasted 5 months before being allowed to move to Portsmouth, where he also won the FA Cup before being transferred, somewhat surprisingly, to Real Madrid. Now, he had a fairly good spell at Real Madrid, winning La Liga and the Copa del Rey and the Super Cup. And so this is not a player who hasn't played. So this is not an unknown player. He was a very good defensive midfielder. He even represented France 34 times and picked up an injury in 2016, which restricted him from playing further. But it all centres around his leaving Real Madrid. Now, at the time he left Real Madrid, he was thought to be going to Lokomotiv Moscow, but then apparently, thanks to the advice of Samuel Eto'o, he decided to go to a club, and I'm going to try and pronounce this right, and I am going to get it wrong. I've never heard of them before, but it's Anzi Makchakala, who were then in the Russian second division, and I'm not saying he moved there for the money, but that was the insinuation. When said club released its entire squad just a year later, he did end up making the move to Lokomotiv Moscow. Now, at first, it was a move that was really successful. He was Lokomotiv Moscow's second most expensive signing, and within no time at all, he'd cemented back-to-back fans Player of the Month awards. Everything was going really well. Then the winter break comes along, and he's never quite the same player afterwards. It turned sour for him in the summer of 2014 when he fell out with the head coach, Leonid Kuchuk, who only spent a year at Moscow himself. But matters came to a head when the club decided they wanted to reduce his salary because they didn't think they were getting full value. He refused, and then even refused to turn up for training. Lokomotiv dismissed Diarra in August of 2014 on the grounds of his refusal to show up for training. With his contract set to expire in 2017, it even sought damages from him for breach of contract. And it managed to get FIFA to ban him. So, having banned him from playing professionally for another club as long as contractual dispute wasn't settled, Kuchuk was also then sacked by the club. But Diarra left the club, and for several months, speculation was linking him with a whole host of teams from West Ham United, Queen's Park Rangers, Inter Milan, Newcastle United, you name it. On 28th of May 2016, Diarra was ordered to pay €10 million fine to Lokomotiv Moscow for the breach of contract by CAS, the Court of Arbitration in Sport, along with $110,000 to CAS themselves. And he was given a 15-month suspended sentence for playing professional football and a suspension of salary, which he'd already served. He then went to Marseille, from Marseille to Al Jazeera, and he ended up finally at Paris Saint-Germain, where he won Ligue 1 with Unai Emery. But this whole case comes out of the dispute. And this is a story that I read in The Guardian but knew nothing about beforehand. Now, essentially, this case revolves around the fact that when Diarra wanted to leave Lokomotiv Moscow, he had an offer from the Belgian club Royal Charleroi. And they made him an offer subject to a guarantee by FIFA that they could have his international transfer certificate, his ITC. So when Charleroi pulled out because they couldn't get his transfer certificate, That's when Diarra decides to make a legal case, just like Mark Bosman had done, and in fact, using Mark Bosman's lawyer from the time, Dupont. Now, they're arguing that the player has been prevented from engaging in his profession by FIFA, who obviously refused to issue the international certificate. Diarra's argument is that he played no role whatsoever in the contract between Lokomotiv and Anzi, but still found himself blocked from resuming his career when he was denied by FIFA. The question now for the European Court of Justice, the same court that ruled on the Bosman case, is whether or not FIFA's refusal to issue an ITC was lawful or not. Now, the ITC regulations constitute the very foundation of how the international transfer system works today. So if the Court of Justice in the European Union find in favour of Diarra this Friday, FIFA are going to entirely overhaul their transfer process. And it looks like it could well be the case. Why do I say that? Well, for this to happen, the Court of Justice in the European Union would only have to be following the recommendation of its Advocate General, Maciej Spooner, who said, quote, "There can be little doubt as to the restrictive nature of FIFA's regulation on the status and transfer of players. By their very nature, the contested provisions limit the possibility for players to switch clubs. The contested provisions necessarily affect competition between clubs on the market for acquisition of professional players." So Spooner added, "The consequences of player terminating a contract without just cause are so draconian that it's highly unlikely that a player would go down this route, and the contested provisions are designed in such a way as to have a deterrent effect and send a chill down each player's spine." Now, the Court of Justice European Union is not obliged to base its decision on its Advocate General's opinion, but can't really ignore it either. As with other recent Court of Justice European Union decisions, notably the UEFA Super League case, European law allows for sports governing bodies to make regulatory interventions which restrict competition and would be considered unlawful, those kind of restrictions that would be considered unlawful outside of the sport, as long as those governing bodies can provide evidence they're not doing so pursuant of their own interests rather than for the good of the game as a whole. Now, Dupont, who's leading the legal team, may have reason to claim that we are about to enter the age of Bosman 2.0. This is a quote: "The likely practical outcome of Diarra will be that transfer system in football as we know it will fall." That was one of the conclusions drawn by the Belgian sports law experts and academics Robbie Huben, Oliver Budzinski and Melchior Vatalet, himself a former Advocate General of the Court of Justice of the European Union, when they examined the case just in June. What could replace it is completely unknown, but we could be looking at a world in which businesses transfer players and contracts of players just as they would do in the real world. And let that sink in for a little while. Transfer windows would be illegal. The whole system as we know it would be completely different. And this may not be a fluid transition from state A to state B. This could wrap football up in legal red tape for years. But at its heart, what it seems like is that a football player would be treated just like any other employee. 4 weeks notice, the opportunity to transfer to and when. I mean, if FIFA loses its right to own the international transfer certificate of a player, then clubs can't really own players. They can employ them. Could we be looking at a world in which a player falls out with a manager and just quits and goes and takes up a job somewhere else? I really don't know. What I do know is that we will find out on Friday. And just like the Bosman ruling before it seemed to pass unnoticed until the conclusion, this could send shockwaves around world football that would eclipse anything that the FA could do to Manchester City. And hardly anyone's talking about it. But let us talk about it. I want to hear from you. Let me know if you think this is possible. Let me know if you think that this is all an inevitable, that the transfer rules don't apply to any other business. What right do FIFA really have to own players? How can players be bought and sold like chattel? I'm really interested to hear from you. I think, for what it's worth, that even though Friday the ruling may be a watered down version, it may make suggestions and recommendations, perhaps not going to be the key moment where things change. We probably aren't going to be, we may not be talking about the Diarra case in the way we talk about the Bosman ruling. But I think long term, with the money coming into football, if this isn't resolved, it is going to get talked about again and again and again. Football is changing. I mean, Man United may never fix their roof, and Tottenham probably never going to win anything. But football itself may be changing more quickly than any of us predicted. I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you know anything about this, let's get a lively debate going. If you knew anything about this, if you have an opinion on it, or if you want to ask more questions, let me know. I will endeavour to answer them. And until I see you again, be lucky. Lots of love.